Your Holiness, this afternoon we're going to look at a different aspect of environmental science, and this is the relationship between the changes that Diana talked about and the health consequences. One of the points you made was saying if it was a doctor telling you you had to change because it's good for your health, then more people would want to. And Dr. Jonathan Patz has the science that makes that case, at least at the global level. You should know that Jonathan is a professor at the University of Wisconsin. The main thing you should know, he lives down the street from Richie Davidson. And they often bicycle together. Good friends. But Jonathan is...
You may also have little sense of competition.
What about cooperation? Could be cooperation. So Jonathan is director of the Global Health Institute at the university. His specialty is ecology and health, very important field. He's co-chair of the group that wrote the health report of the United States National Assessment on Climate Change. He was the lead author on the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that won the Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore for that work.
One of the lead authors, not the lead author.
The lead author.
One of the lead authors.
lead author 망보여서
He's a humble scientist. Yeah, one of the. He's also founding director of the International Association for Ecology and Health, which are scientists globally who are studying this change. And of course, he's written many, many scholarly books and papers on this link. So that will be the topic for this afternoon. Jonathan?
And thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. Your Holiness, it's such an honor for me to be here presenting to you. And what I'd like to do is pick up on a statement that you said in the introduction, which was, given the science, what are the implications of the science? And my role here is to take the environmental science presented by Professor Diana Liverman and ask the question, so what does that mean for human health and well-being? So I'm going to be trying to answer your question about the implications and look at the risks and the ethical aspects, because some people, some populations will be disproportionately affected. So I look at the ethics and in the end take a look at the interdependence of environment and health and the interdependent risks and also opportunities. So this is the outline of my presentation. Number one, looking at the health impacts of one of the issues that Professor Liverman talked about, climate change. And I'll use climate change as a case study of the ethical dimension of environment and health. After that, I'll talk about the interdependence of environment and global health, looking at giving you some examples of how complex these relationships really are. And finally, number three, based on those interdependencies of risks, if everything is interrelated, then maybe there are interdependencies in benefits. So if we solve one problem, maybe we'll solve two or three at the same time. So this is the structure of my presentation. So first, let me talk about this case study of health effects of climate change and why this is a huge ethical dilemma. So here you have a map of the world, and this is what you see are climate-sensitive diseases, looking at where we've seen an increase in diseases like malaria, malnutrition, diarrheal disease, very environmentally climatologically sensitive diseases. Where have we seen an increase in these diseases linked to warming temperatures? And this analysis was done by the World Health Organization, and they looked at the amount of warming from 1960 to 1990, 30 years of greenhouse gases and warming, and they asked the question, what would that small amount of warming, temperature-wise, what would that mean for these climate-sensitive diseases? Malaria, malnutrition, diarrheal disease.
Jonathan, could you explain why they're climate sensitive? Give an example.
Malnutrition is climate dog.
So how does malnutrition be related to climate?
For example.
Okay, so malnutrition, of course, depends on adequate crops, which depend on adequate climate. So droughts, droughts mostly. But something like malaria,
yes, that's right.
which is carried by an insect, mosquito, is very sensitive to external environmental conditions.
True.
If I had a cold and I coughed on you, which I don't worry. But I am 37 degrees centigrade, and if I was to cough on you, this virus would go to another 37 degrees centigrade environment, right? There's not much interaction with the environment. But something like a mosquito-borne disease, like malaria, a lot of the life cycle of that biological system, the parasite, the insect, is very sensitive to the temperature outside. So if the parasite, and I'll show an example in a minute, parasite in the mosquito can be affected by local air temperature. So some of these indirectly transmitted diseases, be they insect-borne or waterborne diseases, are more environmentally sensitive. So that's why they pick, the World Health Organization picked those diseases. So if you look on the map, the red and orange indicate locations with the most climate-sensitive diseases, like malaria and malnutrition. And notice that, former Soviet Union, Canada, the United States, we don't have many of these diseases. And
the southern part of Africa, climatically, not very hot.
it's already hot.
Not very hot.
Not very hot.
Not very hot. The southernmost part.
So the southern hemisphere is
Very, very southern.
like Australia, these. Why is it here? This belongs to red.
Right, right.
Climatically, it's not however.
So from a kind of a point of view of climate itself, those parts of Africa are not that
The
hot
southern
compared to
tip.
southernmost
Right.
tips. But why are they in red?
Right. This analysis actually shows the modeling of future. This is showing the change in those diseases. So even though there are more cases of malaria, in this region than in South America, the question the World Health asked is, based on what we know about malaria and its relationship to temperature, where will we see the biggest change?
Biggest increase, you mean.
And so,
Jonathan, do you mean increase?
biggest increase. So,
Oh.
so in fact, it could be that the countries right next to a country with the most malaria, that adjacent country may see the biggest change. So again, these are where the World Health Organization believes climate change over the last 30 years from greenhouse gas warming will have an impact. So the next question is, who's causing that climate change? This is looking at greenhouse gas effect on climate from 1960 to 1990. These are the countries that will experience the most disease change from the warming. So who's causing the warming? And that's what this map is. And what you see, of course, Africa is in green. They're not really producing greenhouse gases, not burning much fossil fuels, as Diana was talking about. The United States, and this is where I'm embarrassed to be from the United States. But the United States, over the last 50 years, from 1950, and remember the graphs going up from 1950. From 1950 to 2000, the U.S. is the #1 contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So you could say that we in the United States are the most responsible country for causing climate change and causing this ill health in other parts of the world. China is #2, India, former Soviet Union, Canada, they're up there. But, this is where you see that these countries that will suffer the most are not responsible for the original problem. Now, let's take a look at this same data in a different format. And what you're seeing here is a data-driven map. We call this a cartogram, but this is where
the subject Sudanti, data shilishabeton subject Sudan's cartograms. Can you explain? Yeah.
So the size of each country is represented by the number. So on the bottom, again, remember, these are disease numbers. And these are actually mortality numbers in malaria, diarrheal disease, and malnutrition. And so these countries, the bigger the country, the bigger the problem, the bigger the change in those diseases from warmer climates. So on the bottom, you see...
Maybe hygiene is also a factor here.
Those is the border area. The hygiene also difficult.
Well, that's true, and in fact, the poorer you are, the more directly affected you are by changing environments. In a heat wave, if you're wealthy, you can have air conditioning. If you're poor, you're exposed. If you have an increased risk of malaria and mosquito-borne diseases, if you have no shelter, no windows, no screens, you're at higher, you definitely, poverty plays a role in your exposure, your risk for exposure. So what you see is, a lot of suffering. Look at all the suffering in Africa and India. Lots of suffering. But look at the greenhouse gas emissions. Africa just shrivels up. Africa is not really responsible, and the developing world is not responsible for causing global climate change, and yet they're the ones most vulnerable at first. And this, I think this is, to me, I'm not an ethicist, but traveling with Machu and others, and I'm becoming more ethical, I think. But I went to Bhutan with them. But to me, this difference between, those most vulnerable being the least responsible for the problem is the largest ethical challenge that I can imagine. And when I look at this map and I learn more about Buddhism, I'd say, this is where there's a huge role for compassion across nations. When we began the Industrial Revolution 170 years ago, and we built the steam engine, and we burned coal and oil and developed the automobile, we didn't know it was a problem. We didn't know that, burning that pollution and putting in the air, we didn't know that it was harmful. But now we know. And with that knowledge, that what we do in one place affects an innocent person somewhere else, now that we understand that linkage, this is where we need compassion at the United Nations and all over the world to look at that suffering and balance it.
So ethics idea, out of ignorance, and chicken never show me in deep passion. Doesn't matter. Right, she shinto. That is single to seven ethical already.
So this clearly shows that the relationship between ethical responsibility versus knowledge. If you were ignorant in the past, then of course there's less moral responsibility. Right. But once you have the knowledge, then of course the ethical responsibility becomes even more important.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. So here are just some
나도
examples.
다른 중에서 괜찮습니다. 하다.
So someone was saying, those of us who are living in Dharamsala, we are not responsible.
That's right. So these are just some examples of the health effects of climate change. We know that people die in heat waves. Last year, India had a record temperature, 50 degrees centigrade. Hundreds of people died. So we know that there are some significant health effects from extreme weather. So where else in the world are we having record-breaking summer temperatures?
빨리 야오라면 디 배수 주는 거는 되게.
La
빨리 야오라면 배수 주는 건도가.
Pesusana.
배수 주는
Someone was saying that the photograph doesn't seem to be that compelling because the person is wearing a woolen shirt there. Long sleeves.
Your Holiness, you are extremely observant. So where?
Oh, yes, okay.
Okay. So India experienced a record summer temperature last year. Where else in the world might we expect record-breaking summer temperatures? This is a map. This is science done that shows where in the world, in the future, in the next few decades and this century, where we may experience the hottest summers ever recorded in history. And everything in orange, here's the top map, everything in orange or red has a 70% probability or greater, 70 or greater percent probability of experiencing the hottest summer ever recorded. And this is by the middle of this century, only 30 to 50 years from today. These are places, and I think, nearby here, very hot, hottest ever. Now, what about by the end of this century? That's at the bottom. And everything in red indicates places with greater than 90% probability of being hotter than ever recorded in history. What we're concerned from the public health point of view is that today, already 800 million people are at risk from hunger. And these types of extreme temperatures in the summer would be devastating for crops. And according to these scientists published in a very prestigious journal, the journal Science, one of the top two science journals in the world, these scientists believe from their modeling that hunger could double, the risk of hunger could double by the middle of this century. One other example, we talked about malaria and why malaria is so sensitive. This is a graph that shows the relationship between temperature and the parasite as it develops inside the mosquito. What you see is that on the y-axis, temperature, as temperature increases, goes up, the number of days that it takes this parasite, these are two of the main parasites that cause malaria, the number of days that it takes for that parasite to develop inside the mosquito becomes fewer and fewer.
No.
Yes.
So that as temperature rises, mosquitoes are infectious more quickly. So warmer temperatures can lead to malaria epidemics because of this relationship. I do want to just caution you, though, that while you need the right temperature to have the development of malaria, notice that this line flattens out. Whoops. Notice the line flattens out here, which means that below a certain temperature, malaria cannot develop, right? But you need temperature, but this is not the only thing that is causing malaria epidemics. So all sorts of issues, population migration, bed net therapies, drug resistance. There are many factors So I don't want you to think that climate is everything. But
That's right.
you must have the right temperature or you can't have malaria. And malaria kills between 1.5 to 2 million people every year. Most of the deaths are in children. So with this climate temperature-sensitive disease like malaria that's mostly affecting children, this is one of the aspects of ethics of climate change, an intergenerational problem. We're mostly affecting children. And according to the World Health Organization, nearly 90% of climate change health risks would affect children. And diarrheal disease being one, malaria, malnutrition, these are all diseases especially affecting children. But there's another element of the ethical aspects, so not only intergenerational, but places, different regions, different populations will have different extent of risk. This is a map of Bangladesh. Whoops, how did that happen? Whoops, sorry. Here's a map of Bangladesh. And Bangladesh, you know, is a very low-lying country. It's in the river delta. And what this map shows is everything in dark blue here would go underwater with a 1.5 meter of sea level rise. Now, as Dr. Liverman mentioned, there are issues of climate change, including extremes in temperature, extremes of the water cycle, both floods and droughts. But a third one is sea level rise. And the estimates right now, simply from warming the ocean, warming salt water, it expands, thermo-expansion of the oceans, would raise the ocean around a meter, or Diana can correct me on the latest figure, but approximately one meter or so. And this is without glaciers falling into the ocean. So if land-based glaciers, like on Greenland, slip into the ocean, we may have 5 to 10 meters of sea level rise. So this is only looking at the thermo-expansion, the warming the oceans, raising a meter. This would displace 17 million Bangladeshis simply from sea level rise. They would have to move. And the health issues of moving populations, refugees, environmental refugees, is a huge, tremendous health burden. So I want to shift gears now that I've raised some ethical questions of climate change. I want to talk about some other environmental health issues and show the interdependence between the environment and our health. And I want to first show you an example of what happens when you try to solve a problem, a health problem, without understanding the interdependencies. And my first example is one looking at malaria, where the World Health Organization, the WHO Malaria Control Program in Borneo in the 1950s sprayed a pesticide called dieldrin. This is a pesticide to kill the mosquitoes. Seems like a good idea, right? So they sprayed malaria, they sprayed the pesticide, and malaria declined. And not only did the mosquitoes die and malaria drop, but the flies and the cockroaches all disappeared as well. So there was lots of happiness in Borneo. After they sprayed this pesticide, happiness, everyone was happy, beyond expectations. But
No, this is a but. This is
But a little later on, all the straw thatched roofs in the village collapsed. They collapsed. The roofs caved in. And there was a disease epidemic, a typhus epidemic. So the question was why?
typhus le pepe kala ngan dante chawa da shuk chimbo
chawa
na chawa shuk chimbo che karsena chane dare taina chane rig chircha
That's it. Sajor.
la
Darjati.
darte ni kanda chik re moju shibu cha che chawe rig shuk che chir
So I think that you know the answer. Because it's about the interconnectedness of life. So they sprayed the pesticide, dieldrin, and it killed the mosquitoes, but it killed all sorts of insects. It killed ants and cockroaches, and here's a wasp, picture of a wasp. So the pesticide killed all of those insects, but if you know your ecology, poisons go up the food chain. So animals that eat these contaminated insects, they got sick, and the pesticide got concentrated, so that when the cats, these are cats, right here, those are supposed to be dead cats, I don't know, but so the cats ate the contaminated lizards and geckos, and the cats died. And in a village, when cats die, what do you think might happen? Rats and mice. That's exactly what happened. The rat population exploded, and with rats come fleas, which carry the organism that causes the typhus, deadly disease. Now, what about the thatched straw roofs? Well, look, remember this wasp right here, that died.
그래 저 폐결 오셔. 폐결 말해.
지지로
맞아. 지지시 오셔.
말해 시미시 외경게 따지지 사냐면서 지지 배제 시부지
알레.
지지게 지부데
알레. 오늘
So going back to the other question, why did the thatched roofs cave in? Well, this wasp, she normally lays her eggs in these caterpillars, and these caterpillars live in the straw thatch. And when the wasps died, and they weren't laying eggs in the caterpillars and killing them, basically, these caterpillars, the population just took off, and they ate the straw roofs, and that's what explained why the roofs caved in. So this is, if you go in and you solve one problem without understanding the interdependence and interlinkages, you can cause more harm than good, which is why we need to approach each problem with a very interconnected, interdependent approach with many people, with many perspectives at one table. Well, luckily, there are many people, many scientists now that are looking at these linkages.
middle way 말해.
So Holiness is wondering whether there is a middle way in this situation.
We have to control malaria without this sort of facing side effect.
Side effects.
So there must be some kind of middle way.
So you are asking a question, a very important question, which is there are usually always trade-offs, and we need to optimize. We need to find the way that has the fewest unintended consequences. And so there's rarely a perfect solution.
True.
And what we need to do is, and in fact, the World Health Organization allows the spraying, the indoor spraying of DDT pesticides in Africa because it's very effective against the mosquito. But there are trade-offs. There are trade-offs, and you need to try to pick
trade-offs.
Okay. So luckily, there are many scientists that are looking at these interlinkages, and hopefully, if the more we understand the complexity and how everything is linked, the fewer bad outcomes, and maybe the best trade-offs. Maybe we'll find the best middle road because everything is connected, and you simply you need to have that knowledge. There is some good news that this is just like the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC that studied climate change. There was a group of over 1,000 scientists from 95 different countries that conducted something called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And they asked the question, how do intact ecosystems, functioning ecosystems, provide services for human health and human well-being? And here's a cover from their report, Ecosystems and Human Well-Being. And this is where we've developed some terminology. Ecosystem services. How do functioning ecosystems provide services directly to human society? Natural capital. This is the value, the financial value of intact nature. And these are free services from nature. For example, an intact ecosystem will purify water, will regulate climate, will provide food and
regulate climate.
So there are global climate issues, but also here in Dharamsala, if you cut all the trees, your local climate would change. You'd have less moisture. It could be hotter. So there, and also, if you have a steep hillside into a river, the plants, the trees and the small plants hold the water back. So when it rains, your hillside doesn't slide into the river. So flood protection from an intact hillside with plants. And so there's an ecosystem service. Some of the work I do is how intact ecosystems protect us from diseases. And I'll show one example in the next slide. There are other ecosystem services like spiritual and beautiful nature to walk in and to recreate and exercise. That's another service of nature. So there's this effort to try to understand these free services that are extremely valuable, but to up until today have not really been evaluated how valuable they are. So many people are luckily, many people are looking at these linkages. So one example about how an intact system protects us from diseases, this is from work that we've done in the Amazon jungle. And we asked the question, is there a link between the rise in malaria in that location and the destruction of the rainforest? And what we found, this is a graph that shows this species of mosquito, ironically called Anopheles darlingi, but that's a dangerous mosquito that carries malaria. And we find more of these mosquitoes in this habitat. This is what you see on the bottom. This is an intact forest. This is a satellite picture looking down. And the forest looks very intact, looks okay. We don't find that mosquito. If you degrade the forest, if you cut down the forest, and you can see there's some deforestation, we find some of these mosquitoes. And if you look over,
디 싱거디 그런 대신에 그래.
No.
싱거디 대신에 그래 어디.
So the fields, the fields, are they kind of
Looks farm.
Looks like a kind of farmland. Is that farmland or
no,
is it just
no, this is from high up on a satellite. Those are roads. Those are logging roads.
Oh, I see.
And people talk about when you look from satellite at a forest, it's called a fishbone pattern of deforestation. You have a main road and then logging roads that go like this. So those are from cutting the trees. And in this, on the right here, this is the most degraded forest, not many trees left. We find more of this dangerous mosquito. Now you might ask, many people ask, mosquitoes are attracted to people. So if you have more cutting of the trees, there are more people, right? So what we did, we actually factored this in. We controlled for the number of people. So we know that it's not more people in this location. It's actually the change in the landscape. And not only did we find more of these mosquitoes in that location with the deforestation, but we dipped for mosquito larvae in the water and found more mosquito larvae in the deforested area. So we believe that in this instance,
신나 유예백급다. 신나 용을 침배. 그래서 금자로 출직립. 네.
So, I mean, would it be the case that you would have tested on the same water before it was deforested, or, I mean, how did that?
No, we picked different places. We picked a place with nice forest, big tall trees, and another place with not, like some small trees, and then another place with no trees.
안 되게 될 말이야. 마스크로 밀코고 그랬어. 그래서 민망스디 마스크로 먹을 수 있어 말이야.
지단데 들어봐. 내가 다는데 좀 전에 민망하게 깬거 레몬도스. 간다 쿠유 코란을 식망 용거 돈에. 더 마스크로 나자 기니데서 거라. 지단 마스크. 더 마스크로 나자 기니데니 쿠유 그잖아 망도스.
So we think there's a link between cutting the rainforest and an increase in malaria in this region.
So what is the causal explanation?
Very good question. We do not know the answer, the mechanism. We looked at the pools of water, and we find differences in the algae, the plant life around the water. We found that the pools of water with the most of these bad mosquitoes had partial sunlight, a little bit of sunlight.
But thick forest and sunlight, right? Yes.
But we don't exactly know the reason. We don't know the mechanism. That was our observation. But we need some.
Mosquito 그렇게 진짜.
You could have just asked the mosquito.
I'll do that.
그래서 지금 로체 mosquito brain에 또 심주체 친구다.
Maybe with Richie's help, you can look at mosquito's brain.
So I will follow up on this with Richie. So, Your Holiness, finally I'd like to, my last part of this talk is to look at the interdependence, and if everything is interdependent, then if we think about interventions and doing things, solving the problem, we could have positive win-win situations, or with co-benefits, where you try to solve one problem and you automatically solve more. You know, that would be the best thing, you know. So I'm going to talk about these co-benefits. Now, Professor Liverman talked about fossil fuels causing global climate change and greenhouse gases. But also, she said that burning oil and coal cause regular air pollution, dirty, unhealthy air. And that is one issue that we think that if we try to reduce greenhouse gases, the number one solution is to reduce burning fossil fuels. We'll have a side benefit of cleaner air quality. Already today, 800,000 people die prematurely every year from air pollution.
Is that a global statistic or
This
national?
is a global statistic from the World Health Organization.
Yes.
They've actually increased it. It should be 900,000 deaths every year from air pollution around the world. They also look at the fact that many cities are now designed for the automobile. And because we drive the car so often, many of us are not walking or bicycling, and that's a health concern. And according to the World Health Organization, this number, they estimate almost 2 million deaths occur prematurely from lack of physical activity. And another number there is about 20 million years of healthy life lost, according to the World Health Organization, from lack of physical activity. So if we were to think about mitigating or reducing greenhouse gases to solve the global warming problem, we can have some immediate, tomorrow, some major health benefits. We've already seen some of these. There are natural experiments. The Olympics, you want your athletes to be breathing clean air, right? In 1996, the Olympics were in Atlanta, Georgia. And Atlanta has an air pollution problem. So to have a cleaner air quality, they had laws in place and they reduced traffic by 23%. And not surprisingly, air pollution fell 28%. So guess what happened? A wonderful health benefit. There was less childhood asthma. Fewer children were being sent to the emergency room for asthma. It dropped by 42% just by reducing traffic. So we have evidence. And I know...
So for how long did this last, this reduction of traffic?
Well, I don't exactly know the answer, but I believe it was only for the Olympics.
One month?
Maybe roughly a month, yeah?
Not sure. Not sure.
Yeah.
Now, I've noticed...
So it's striking because it's very obvious, very evident. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I mean, based on these things, there are interventions. We're trying to reduce...
the economy.
So although it's a bit unrelated, but by reducing the traffic by that percent, what is the negative impact on the economy? Has it been done or no?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Good question.
Yeah.
But I do, I can tell you that
any economy
for example, we hear and read about calculations of economic negative impact on economy by people striking for X number of days and not driving to the workplaces and so on. So there are all these ways of measuring the economic negative impact.
Yeah, there are other people that might be able to answer this later. But I don't know the economic impact. But I will tell you that, traffic-related air pollution it's pretty well recognized as a big problem. So based on these findings, I think more laws, this strengthen the evidence. And I've been to Delhi twice. This is only my second time coming through Delhi. And I came 9 years ago for an air pollution meeting. And 9 years ago, the air pollution in Delhi was much worse. So in Delhi, they've made major beneficial changes in requiring, natural gas vehicles, eliminating the two-stroke engines. So the air quality is getting better in Delhi. So there are
저
information.
남들 죽을 왜 나와?
No.
야, 들리냐? 나와도 죽을 왜?
Yeah, but the month during which you visit
Same
Delhi
season?
also makes a difference. Was it the same month or?
Yeah, it was similar. It was similar.
Both.
Yeah,
It was.
Summer,
It was, I think, October. So we see this relationship. And just in case, because you are just in case you're wondering, did this number drop because fewer people were driving their children to the emergency room? The scientists found no change in non-asthma related illnesses. So for stomach upset or any other thing, there was no change. So it wasn't because fewer people were driving to the emergency room. This is a real evidence-based, well-controlled study.
Oh, that's why I'm wondering. The number, 이게 다 토부션 로데죠, 알바. 디 에볼루션, 디 사실상 디 캐요래 말이야.
So just wondering, because the air pollution caused by aeroplanes emission, which is so high,
Several hours in
flight long,
high.
high, yeah, and the pollution that you see on the ground in the cities.
Any differences?
Yeah, the air, the emissions from airplanes is affecting the climate. Those emissions, except when you're in the airport and on the runway, that's ground level. We only are exposed to the ground level pollution. So airplanes are bad for two reasons. One, they affect the climate, but also on the ground they.
이제 알아.
근데 이게 막 바짝에서 말이야. 또 그런 사람들 남단이야.
다 오존 라이어스들이 직벌배.
No.
오존 라이어스들이 이펙트 차죠, 알바.
나를.
오존 라이어스.
나를.
디 남들이 군에 가서 랑보다마다 사실상 찍으려 그래.
So in terms of the emissions impact upon ozone layer, is it this sort of equally impactful, whether it is a ground level pollution or a very high level in aircraft pollution?
So remember, I'm the public health scientist, so I will defer that to Deanna. But the chlorofluorocarbons, the chlorine that goes up into the upper stratosphere, that's where the ozone layer is affected. Very different from the ground level ozone smog pollution. But the ozone layer, you can ask Diana later. One other quick example, we don't have health numbers, but Beijing, the Olympics in Beijing,
Yes.
the government in China spent $17 billion to clean up the air quality to have a green Olympics. And we don't have the health numbers, but the pollution numbers, you can see that this, nitrogen dioxide fell by 38%. Particulate matter, very dangerous, fell by 20%.
Could you explain nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter? What do you mean by that, by those two phrases?
So particulate matter is like a diesel truck. You see the black smoke coming out of a diesel truck, or burning wood. You see the black smoke. That's dangerous. Those are the particle matter, especially the small particles, and that's been shown to be very harmful to breathe. Nitrogen dioxide comes from burning fossil fuels. Nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, this is from smoke out of a factory, and those can form aerosols that are harmful to breathe. So these are products of combustion of fossil fuel. But the most dangerous one is that particulate matter. So I'm getting close to the end here. Speaking of particulate matter, we have these examples from Atlanta, from Beijing. So I chose to, my research team has looked at air pollution for our region, because I'm worried about Richie Davidson's health. So Richie and I live somewhere about here, and there's Chicago. This is the Great Lakes region. And so this is actually a pollution map, and you can see the red colors are indicating more pollution in the cities. What we did was we asked the question, if in Atlanta they reduced traffic by 23%, and they had that amazing health benefit of less asthma, what if we could get rid of 20% of the car trips in our region of the world? And in fact, that 20% of car trips represents the shortest car trips across 11 of the largest cities in our region. These are car trips that are less than 4 kilometers. So if you're in a city, not in the rural area, but in a city, if the short trips were eliminated, how would that change the air quality? And then how would that air quality affect the population's health? And we found that if we could eliminate these short car trips, we would save 500 lives every year in the region. And we would avoid hundreds of thousands of illnesses, like respiratory illness, heart disease, all sorts of illnesses, and just by taking the short car trips off the road. Now, what if half...
short trips kilometer
about 4 kilometers distance.
4 kilometers, 8 kilometers round trip.
8 kilometers, yeah.
Round trip.
cycle
If you bike, how long will that take? 4 kilometers.
Well, if you were in Dharamsala,
no. In there. Dharamsala, of course.
so this region is
Dharamsala, not your business.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm just thinking, so those people who loves car, they may argue, by car, I save such minutes.
Time.
So 1 minute, $1 or something like that, isn't it? So I'm just wondering, per kilometer, yeah, modern I remember, bicycle, come
So His Holiness, wondering. So a lot of people may immediately start thinking in terms of the time that is saved by driving. So he's wondering how long would it take to bike that distance, 4 kilometers an hour?
So, Your Holiness, I cycled to campus from about 3 miles is what, 6 kilometers?
5, yeah.
5 kilometers away. So that's actually about the length we're talking about. If I drive, and because of the traffic in the morning and the afternoon, it takes me at least 25 minutes to get to my office door. On the bike, it takes me 20 minutes.
So
It's actually faster on the bicycle.
And in many cases, it's faster by bike because you also
right, yes.
Because it's a flat area. It's faster by bike because you also you avoid traffic and you don't worry about parking.
Yes,
really?
that's why it's shorter. Yes. Parking kids are there.
So the only problem is in the wintertime when you have ice and snow. So we asked the question, what if half of these short car trips were made by bicycle and only limited to the best 4 months of the year, the summertime, actually not even the hot days. We picked the best 4 months of climate and say half of these trips and only in the best weather conditions, what would be the added benefit? And what we found was that in addition to the air quality improvement, if half of those short trips were made by bicycle, the benefit from physical fitness would now save 1,100 lives every year. So this is why the interconnectedness, if we think about mitigating climate change by burning less fossil fuel, by reducing greenhouse gases, we also can enhance personal fitness and reduce air pollution. And this is why I think that this interdependence of solutions, the interdependence, fighting global climate change and global warming, could be one of the greatest public health opportunities we've had in a century.
Wonderful, wonderful. Wonderful presentation. Very good.
So I want to give you just some envisioning change here. This is a street, I think maybe in Atlanta. It doesn't look very healthy. It could look like that, or it could even look like that. We need to begin to think about these, how to make our cities not just built for automobiles, but built for people. And this is where I look to your wisdom and some of your writing, and you talk about everything starts with the individual. And everything, we start with ourselves. And I put up Gandhi's quote here, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." This actually is a picture of my house. And this is, I am 5 houses down from Richie and Susan Davidson. So he lives nearby. So, and this is a picture of my house, and this is a picture of the vehicle I use to go get groceries at the grocery store.
So this is wonderful because in the classical Buddhist literature, there is a reference to 4 qualities that a teacher should try to embody. One of which is to not only share your wisdom with others, but actually live it, embody it.
Right.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And this is my last slide, and I put this here not to be vain or show off. I used to live in a place where if I tried to bicycle to work, it was very dangerous. And I live in a city with Richie that's very bikeable, and this is where I think we have an opportunity to design cities so this is possible. Many people that I give this presentation to, they say, this is not possible where I live. And that's the case in many cities around the world. So I think one of our missions is to make cities livable like this. So this has been a pleasure to present to you.
Do you have any?
Yes. Now nothing left. All questions come out because of the spontaneous.
Spontaneously.
And let me open it up to the panelists.
So maybe, Diana, you can pick up on the question that His Holiness asked about the impact from the ground level air pollution versus the high level emission from the aeroplanes on ozone.
Let's see.
No.
Yes. I will try, but actually, Your Holiness, I would prefer to wait till later in the week so I can make sure I give a good answer. But there is a difference between ozone at the ground, where it's dangerous, and ozone in the stratosphere, where it's protective. But I think later, perhaps we could discuss the issue of aviation, because I think it's a source of guilt for many of us. And I would like to make sure I give exactly the right information.
엔 DH understand 지단 남군자 토자를 찍도가
내릴
근데 그저나
fit on songs
30,000
내릴
40,000
내릴
라 feet the space contrast 도가
내릴
아마 공고서 줄어야지
그래서 concord
딜을 더 말해
내릴 토임 주면
티티하게 연으면
His Holiness is also wondering at the altitude at which the aeroplanes fly. For example, the regular planes fly somewhere between above 30,000 feet. And then Concords are supposed to fly even higher than that. So their impact, again, on environment, I mean, are there any differences or?
Again, I would rather
so
check
while
my
you are
data.
checking I want to see to
So if you could check that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are also a couple of very interesting natural experiments that I will look at. One was when the Iceland volcano stopped everybody flying, and also after 9/11 there were no flights, and both of those people have studied the impact on the environment of that period of not flying. One of the things that the planes do is they help create clouds through the emissions, and so it may be that aviation has a slightly cooling effect on the climate from the clouds that they create, but of course they produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions that warm, so you have to look at the balance.
I actually have a question, Jonathan, which is, well, for me, you talked about the concept of the intact ecosystem, and also thinking a little bit from something of a Buddhist perspective and the notion of impermanence. Of course, intact sounds like static, meaning it doesn't change. And I'm sure you don't mean that it is unchanging. And one of the examples I'm thinking of is something I've read about, and I don't really know the details, but my understanding is that there are many ecosystems in which fire actually plays a role. So we sometimes have very large wildfires in the western United States, for example, where lots of acres are burned, and these are often the result of what we might call unnatural conditions or man-made conditions.
Or lightning.
Or lightning, but in other cases, there could be a natural cycle of burning and restoration of a forest that has simply been occurring long before humans were present in those areas and long before the industrial age. So if you took a picture from a satellite, you'd see a green forest one year, and then because there was a fire in that area, you'd see it all burned down in the next. But isn't that still an intact ecosystem? So I'm wondering if you could explain to me, I have no idea about these things, what you mean by intact exactly.
Let me add to the question. He wants to know about intact. I want to know about ecosystem. Would you
Both
define
of those, yes.
ecosystem?
Ecosystem and intact.
Because it's a very important word for our discussion.
Yes.
네. 멤버에서 좀 미소 멤체. 아니요.
System peruchigorwa. The ecosystem is the core condition language.
So first, about ecosystems. Ecosystems are defined in many different ways, through food webs, through energy cycles, and there's a functioning interdependence of an ecosystem. As far as changing ecosystems and natural fires, there are issues at different scales of time, and there are enormous complexities where even ecologists don't pretend to understand all of the interconnections. And I wouldn't want you to think that that things are unidirectional. If you preserve a forest and you don't change anything in it, that always leads in a certain direction to less disease. So, you know, you're asking. it's one of these issues of trade-offs again. We have to clear some land for agriculture, to feed ourselves, and would you just not touch that at all? You'd have to say, to some extent, for society, we should do, we can change things a little bit for more direct benefit. But in some cases, if we were to clear a whole area and plant one crop, a monoculture, and have no wild biodiversity or a bank of species, if a pathogen, a disease, a plant disease came in, it could wipe out the crop. And this is where, at least having some intact natural systems in agriculture, that's been shown to be very beneficial. But I don't pretend to know, I don't think ecologists will tell you that they know all of those interdependencies.
If I could follow up, Your Holiness, but I mean, part of what I'm saying is it sounds like intact just means not affected by humans, as if humans were not part of the ecosystem. So I'm curious how you're using the word intact, and so I can understand more clearly, what effects exactly you're pointing to.
Right.
So if non-humans somehow change an area, that means it's still intact. Yeah, so what's the difference between sort of natural change? Is it just the presence of humans that constitutes the loss of it being intact?
Well, I'll first say that I'm not an ecologist, but I work with ecologists. And there is this issue of humans as part of nature versus us and nature, and I think our later speakers will get into that a little bit. I don't think I don't know of a definition of, when you say, if it's human, if it's caused by humans, it's always bad. That's not necessarily true.
The ice age 사주를 미술게 말하고 그런 식으로.
For example, we speak about the changing from the ice age and so on. So these cycles of change have nothing to do with human action. It's part of the natural cycle of change.
Right, but getting back to Diana Liverman's talk, it's things are always changing.
Yes.
Things are always changing. It's the speed, the rate of change. It's that we are cutting forest, many square kilometers every year, and we are changing the climate system faster than would naturally occur. It's this rate of change, I think, that has the ecologists the most concerned.
I think Greg had a question, and then Diane, did you want to speak directly to that?
I mean, with the question of intact, I think the other way is to think about what does disturbed mean. And forests, for example, have been affected by fire for centuries, but the recent results suggest that we may have doubled the risk of fire, not just because humans are there and maybe causing the fires, but because of global warming. So we're increasing the damage to the ecosystem. So ecosystems always fragmented and changed, but it's the extra burden and the extra fragmentation that we're placing that's causing more mosquitoes, or the concerns about the outbreak of some of the very infectious diseases like Ebola and others. And that's where deforestation is really very challenging in terms of the possibility of interactions that could create very serious disease.
Great.
Your Holiness, I'd like to address two of the topics that came up around traffic in Jonathan's presentation. First, you asked what would the economic impacts be of less driving, And it reminds me of the story that in the United States, many cities people have been proposing to create zones in the center of cities with no driving allowed. And the businesses there initially protest this idea because they're worried that they'll have fewer customers. But the cities which have tried it, by far the majority find that they get more customers because people like to go and have an experience of walking in the street with no cars. So it's we still let the trucks come to make the delivery, but no cars driving and more customers. That's a win-win. And the other win-win, I wonder, Jonathan, in your research about traffic, when you took 20% of the cars off the road, did you include traffic modeling that shows?
Can you say what traffic modeling is?
So His Holiness asked, for example, less driving. Well, if you don't drive, maybe you bicycle, you might lose time. But the thing that happens when you stop driving is all the other cars go faster, a little bit faster because there's less traffic. And so everyone else is saving a little bit of time, and everyone else is also reducing their emissions. So the benefits, 20% less cars means more than 20% reduction in emissions, because now all the rest of the cars are moving faster and more efficiently. And everyone else still on the road is saving time.
성화편에서 네, 모든 용신사는 라이트 들으시지.
Craig, thank you for your question. This analysis was done by a very, very large team, and I will argue, and in fact, these results are coming out on November 2nd, so in 2 weeks. The beginning of this analysis starts with a very sophisticated emissions model, pollution from the tailpipes of the automobile, looking at location by census tract, very specific location, by the type of road, by the speed of traffic. So it's a very high resolution geographic spatial analysis of pollution coming out of tailpipes of cars.
It's a computer model.
It's a computer model. It's called Pluto, but I can't remember what it stands for. But anyway, so we have a very sophisticated, and in fact, even something very interesting, the most pollution from a car comes from short trips, because when the engine is cold, before the catalytic converter and the pollution mechanisms, before they warm up, your first emissions are the worst ones. We call this cold start. So the short car trips are even worse. So we factor in that we gain that benefit from reducing these short trips are even more effective. So then we take that model and we hand it over to a team of air pollution modelers. And they give us the air pollution scheme, and then they give us the air pollution, and we put that into our health model. So it was a major model linking, but absolutely, this is the best analysis we have. Check the results on November 2nd.
I have a question, both for Diana and for you. We've been hearing many predictions of what's going to happen with climate change. How do you make those predictions? And how certain are you of those predictions? Maybe this is more for Diana than for you.
Well, the question is not unrelated between our two talks, because a lot of the work that Jonathan is trying to do in terms of modeling the impacts of climate change depends on climate scientists modeling the change in the climate.
Could you explain the word modeling?
It's what we do is put our basic understanding of how the climate works, and some of this is based on physics, the sort of basic material of physics, that, for example, warm air holds more moisture, or carbon dioxide traps heat. But the atmospheric system is so complicated that we can't put not everything in the model is physics. Some of it is statistical correlations based on observation of past behavior. So we build these computer models based both on our theory of how the atmosphere works, but also on past observations of how the atmosphere works. And then the first thing we have to do when we've built the computer models is run them to see if they can reproduce the observed climate of today. Because if a computer model couldn't reproduce what's happened in the past and what happens now, we would have very little faith in the future.
So you test the model.
We test the model against observations. We also vary our assumptions to see if we've put something in that then produces unrealistic behavior. And then only when we're confident that the model does a good job of reproducing the atmosphere do we then change an assumption, like the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, or some other variable, the warmth of the ocean. And then we run the model for 1 year after another out into the future and look at how the climate evolves. And so they're very much based on our understanding of physics and our observation of past behavior. And then we project forward into the future. But what we have to do, because we don't know whether people are going to continue to not act, and we don't know if possibly people will change and do the right thing and reduce emissions.
You don't know how many people are going to start bicycling for short trips.
Yes. So what we do is we work with what we call scenarios, which are alternative futures. And so the climate modelers usually work with what they call business as usual, which is continuation of current behavior. And those are the ones that tend to give us the very high temperatures. But we also look at scenarios that assume people will do half what is needed, or people would do everything that is needed. And then we can actually provide information. If we make this choice, we would have this climate future. And if we make this choice, we would have a different future. And what's interesting for this group is to imagine the different futures. Can we imagine a future where we've done everything that we could do? Or is the more realistic future that we do some of what we can do? And for each of those futures, we get a different climate. The one thing we can't include in our models very well is things that nature might do. So if there was a year with a lot of volcanic eruptions, I mean, we could put that into the model, but we don't know if that's going to happen.
So what's your certainty that Delhi will be 105, whatever the centigrade was?
Well, the way we...
122 Fahrenheit.
50 centigrade,
50
yeah.
centigrade.
What we do is the other thing that we do to try and increase confidence. Yeah. The other thing we do to try to increase confidence in the climate models is we don't just do one prediction. We do hundreds and thousands, and there are also now 15 different groups of scientists around the world in many different countries who are all working together, but with slightly different models to do these projections.
Because the future has different possibilities, they're testing each
But also
range.
science may have slightly different assumptions about the physics. So one group might have placed more importance on clouds in their model. But by having multiple groups doing the models, and then also having each group doing lots and lots of projections, because there's a certain amount of stochastic, how would we, there's a certain amount of random behavior in the atmosphere. So you do it over and over again. And then what we create are results that say there's a certain chance of this happening. So in the case of the heat waves in Delhi, I can't give you that chance right now without reading the paper again. But what it would tell you is that there's a 70% chance or an 80% chance. And what happens is, what is beautiful about and fascinating about the science, but also very difficult, that my colleagues would run a climate model that would produce thousands and thousands of results, a sort of a picture of what might happen. And then I give that to poor Jonathan with all of this data, and then he then has to make his estimates based not only on all the complexity of the climate system, but all the complexity of the behavior of the mosquito and the behavior of humans. So it's fascinating scientifically, but we get all of these layers of our assumptions and needing to test that make it very complicated.
Is it too early to know whether any of the models have successfully predicted certain outcomes? In other words, have any of the models, is it too soon to know that?
No.
Or some of the models turned out to be correct?
No, the first computer models that were modeling the climate, the impacts of global warming, were actually being done when I was a student in the early 1980s. In fact, I was fortunate to study at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in the US, where these models were just being produced. And so we've now got 30 years of, first of all, improving the models. But one of the things we can do now is to compare, we can compare what the models said 30 years ago against what actually happened. But because they're computer models, you can also go back and start them in 1980, run them forward, and compare it to what we've actually observed. And what we've seen is that the computer models have accurately predicted, for the most part, the warming that we have observed, and also some of the changes in extremes. So that's why we're much more confident in the projections of the models now than we were, say, 30 years ago, because we've been able to compare them to what has actually happened. Mm-hmm. But the other big change in the models that was always a challenge and links to Jonathan's work is the very first models had very coarse, very large-scale predictions. And this was because we didn't have the power in computers. We were working with cards in computers, not laptops. Now with the computing power and also with better understanding, we can produce much more detailed predictions of what might be happening. And this is a lot of what people like Jonathan need in order to give us more accurate examples of the impacts. So in the very first climate models, they didn't have the Himalayas. There were no mountains. And in fact, the oceans were just 1 foot deep. Now we have models that include the mountains of the world. They include a real ocean. So we're working constantly to try to improve the models in order to improve the impacts, right, and hopefully in order to improve the solutions.
So and that's where, you know, the models that come from the climatologists, where we use them in public health, it's not just at the small local level that we need information, but it's how frequently will we have an extreme heat wave and how long will it last. These are the most important determinants for in a heat wave for us. The heat wave that hit Europe in 2003, do you remember that? 2003?
Yes.
They estimated 70,000 people died in 11 days. That heat wave, you can't say that was global warming, but the climatologists have looked at how hot, how extreme that summer temperature was. It was, you know, the normal distribution goes like this, and that summer was like over here. And the climatologists have looked at the probability of having such an extreme temperature, and they're able to say, based on climate science, the amount of greenhouse gases put into the atmosphere in the last 30 years changes not just the temperature doesn't go like this. It's more a matter of frequency of extreme events, getting more and more. And the climatologists have said that that extreme heat wave that killed 70,000 people was doubled in probability. Mm-hmm. The probability of that extreme event was doubled because of greenhouse gases and how greenhouse gases affect the climate. And this is where we know that when the climate, when it's average temperature, when it's average moisture, we're doing well. But at the extremes, both cold and hot, dry and flooding, it's the extreme events that are concerning to people in agriculture, ecology, and in public health. And the story of climate change from the climatologists is that things are not going to be a gradual change. It's the increase in the frequency of extreme events. And that's why me, as a public health scientist, that's where I get very concerned, because we don't do well under extreme conditions.
Well, is there any good news about global warming?
Yeah.
Are there any benefits
Yes.
to anybody?
Global warming
Are you asking?
I'm asking you.
I'll answer first. There will be a reduction in people dying from cold temperature.
둘로 두고 건거 말해.
You don't have to wear thick clothes, yeah.
Right.
나 둘로 두고 시작해서 왜 또 어떻게 써 또?
Because when you wear really thick clothes, you feel the weight.
Right, right. There's some diseases will disappear. You know,
Oh yes.
there's some diseases that are carried by ticks. You know, ticks.
Yes.
Ticks.
남사 중에서도 hot climate is no mosquito.
There are some diseases that will decrease, and places like the former Soviet Union will have better food production, better crops in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. So there will be winners and losers. And in my participation with the United Nations IPCC,
overall average country you know 말해.
So we really have to look at it from an average global point of view, rather than overall.
Otherwise, we can't say.
so do you?
Oh, nothing. Zero.
I mean, when we do the assessment for the United Nations, the conclusion of our health chapter has been, you know, there'll be some decline in disease and some increase, but on balance, there will be more adverse health effects than beneficial. And that's been consistent in all of our assessments.
What about the Tibetan Plateau? Yeah.
There are a few studies that suggest that there are some benefits for some people on the Tibetan Plateau because it's very cold in winter.
That's right.
And there are a lot of respiratory problems. So there are some suggestions that there could be some benefits, and also that people might be able to grow a wider range of crops with the warmer temperature. There's also an example that I think it was Raffaella told me of how with the melting of the permafrost, the lakes are getting larger, and that is increasing the population of cranes, the birds that can migrate. But then, of course, there are lots of negatives as well.
That means more food.
Oh,
Many Chinese was fond to hunt these birds.
oh, they're very beautiful. So
in early 60s, so there were cases. So those cranes or some kasa, angba,
Geese.
ducks,
Geese.
no, geese or
Geese.
geese. When Tibetan, usually with Tibetans of dress, they don't fly. When was some Chinese
Trousers.
Come, they immediately fly. Then later, some Chinese dress, Tibetan dress, and then hunting.
that's what we call adaptation. But I think that this question of the geographic balance of places that benefit and places that lose, because whilst some people might eat better or be a little warmer in cold regions, it would be at the expense of the millions of people in the river basins who will have less water. So I think this is a big question, because there are some countries who are less keen to negotiate an agreement on climate change because they think they could benefit.
Right.
Yeah. And how do we get the countries to look at those that are going to lose?
Great.
To build on this, I think, Your Holiness, you mentioned right at the beginning of today that human beings are, we can imagine the future, and we can predict the future, and we can, I think, adapt. So we can think in terms of some populations of human beings will be more able to adapt. Other groups of parts of the world will have much more difficulty adapting. But can you say a few words about nature? About biodiversity and animals, which don't have the same ability to predict climate change, and in many cases can't move because we've cut off the migration, and the changes will be much more rapid than the changes that the species have been, dealing with before.
Maybe Jonathan or Dankila can. One of the strong indicators that the climate is changing is that there have been thousands of studies of what's been happening to the distribution of birds. And what we found was that about 80% of the studies showed that birds are moving towards the poles or up the mountain slopes. And this is very consistent with a response to global warming. So we can already see that birds who have more flexibility to move are starting to respond to a changing climate. But for many other species, first of all, they don't have that mobility. And also the places they need to cross to get to a cooler mountain are occupied by humans. So Dankila can talk about this, because World Wildlife Fund is now having to think about, we've invested this money in protecting nature in these particular places, but what happens if the climate changes and those species are no longer going to be there? So I was recently in Australia, and in Australia, they're talking about assisted migration of species, where humans will actually have to help ecosystems move to a different place because of climate change. And this is really a human-dominated planet where we're helping species move. But I don't know if you want to.
I could use an example of tigers. most of the tigers in the India-Nepal area are in the Tarai, which is the lowlands. But in the last 3-4 years, we've seen evidence from camera traps that tigers are starting to climb. And so some of you might have seen this photograph. It was from a camera trap in Bhutan, where a tiger was seen at 4,000 meters. So this is unprecedented. We've never seen tigers before this high in snow, and what's happened is they're in snow leopard territory. So tigers are quite large and snow leopards are very small. So one of the things that we wildlife ecologists now have to worry about is the tension that's going to happen between two predators and which predator is going to dominate in this landscape. So, I mean, Diana made this point, you know, organizations like WWF have invested a lot of time, a lot of funding to protect areas. You know, we thought this is where a tiger landscape is, and we've done our best to protect it. And now we're finding out that the foliage is changing, the trees are changing, so all the animals are starting to move. The first thing that happens is it's not the predators, it's actually the prey that start to move. So like deer, they're the ones that move, and the predators follow. So one of the things we're now looking into is wildlife corridors. And it gets very complex because if you're in the Tarai, it's a very highly populated area. Lots and lots of human beings live there. So how do we negotiate with the communities that they let a tiger or a herd of elephants go through their villages, you know, trying to figure out ways to get communities to think that protecting tigers is good for them. And coming up with solutions like that is a very big challenge. The other thing is we have to really understand how species act. A tiger is a solitary animal. It needs 5 kilometers on either side before it goes through a forest. So if, let's say, in a 5-kilometer radius, there is some kind of human activity, it's actually not going to go through. So it's not enough that we just protect the forest. We actually have to create this corridor that's quite wide. So this is just one example of some of the impacts.
Jonathan?
Right. Do you want to?
What?
Okay.
어. 또 미련식 가서 지식적인 말씀을 줘야 돼.
고유 교원들도 그걸 심전수야.
Just one comment. We are still talking about climate effects and changing in vegetation and migration of animals and the need for these corridors to travel. But again, we're really looking at global environmental change. And as Diana had pointed out, climate change is a big topic, but not the only topic. And many of the changes in biodiversity from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report, you know, we have changed the landscape of the Earth, especially for agriculture. And land use change, what we do on the landscape, has a faster impact on species biodiversity. And so I just want to, we mentioned this morning when we started focusing on climate change, just to remember that it's global environmental change and not just about climate change. And some of these land use issues are more immediate and just as important. Just to throw that in there as a reminder.
Could you unpack that? You mean land that was forest is becoming farms, so animals have nowhere to go, or?
Land.
What are some examples?
Examples from cutting forest for livestock and agriculture, to simply building roads through fragmenting, cutting into pieces an area that completely changes the biodiversity structure of an area. So, you know, those are some examples.
Lyme disease, the case of Lyme disease.
Lyme disease is a very interesting example. This is.
Lyme disease.
저는 들으셔 가지고 좀 중요한 바시스 말이에요. 이
척투하기 푸지.
그래서 바시 말 들으셔서 이 빼봐, 부 빼봐. Is it coming from the tick? Is it coming from the tick? 바시 세종아. 이 강보만 붙여버지.
정말?
둔둘이요. 대시 말에 바시 있어도.
바시.
바줄이요. 심전이요. 들어봐. 강보만 보이는 킬레요.
In America, the Lyme disease fish.
룩시사를 거기.
룩시소들.
룩시사로.
키시란 말이에요.
We're discussing what a tick is.
The Lyme disease, the didn't kill on your.
I see.
The kill on your the level ya the long.
So,
The ringema than to Jeffrey Lato.
Tiny.
Lyme.
so Lyme disease, can I go? Yeah, okay.
Sure.
So this is an example of where a change in biodiversity in the number of species directly affects the risk of this disease. For Lyme disease, you have the tick. What?
Yeah, tick is
the
fine.
tick,
Yeah.
the little tick that bites you. But the bacteria that causes Lyme disease, the bacteria actually is mostly in a mouse. The natural reservoir host, the natural place where the bacteria occurs is in mice in the environment. If you have a big expanse of forest, you have lots of animals. You've got, mice, you have raccoons, you've got monkeys, you've got a lot of richness of species. And many of them may eat mice. And so that may reduce your number of mice. But also, if these little ticks, what should I?
It's fine.
Tick is fine. Yeah.
Ticks, they need blood, so they feed on different animals. And if they feed on a mouse that has the Lyme disease bacteria, the tick becomes infected and dangerous to people. So if you have a forest, big forest, lots of different animals, the tick feeds on everything. And that tick might not pick up the bacteria and be dangerous. But if you chop up the forest into little pieces, so now the forest is just fragmented, that reduces the number of species because foxes, monkeys, they need more space. So if you chop up into little fragments of forest, the only animal you have left may be a mouse. Mice can live anywhere. So in a chopped up forest, the probability that a tick will get infected with the bacteria increases because they're only mice. And so this is a direct relationship about how species richness can actually reduce the risk of a disease. And if you change the landscape, you change the biodiversity, you can actually change the risk of that particular disease.
Did you have something to say?
Your Holiness asked twice about the economic impacts, and so I want to switch back to climate change just for a second and answer the question about the pros and cons of global warming from an industry perspective. And just as there are disparities between countries, about pros and cons, Canada probably will not mind global warming, whereas Africa will mind very much the disparities between industries. And so for the shipping industry, for example, having access to the North Passage that Columbus already looked for.
Can you say what the North Passage is?
The North Passage is a shipping route around the top of Canada, not northern Canada. Yes. It's a huge boon and a huge economic advantage.
It was blocked by the
ice.
Yes,
that's right. At the same time, the insurance industry and the reinsurance industry, like Lloyd's of London, they're hugely concerned about climate change because their business is based on the fact that catastrophes occur randomly and are not connected. But because of these interdependencies we talked about, catastrophes are becoming increasingly huge, larger, and much more connected. So their whole business model is disappearing. And so they're really looking for forecasts on how to react to that.
I think much damage is due to economic reasons. And that also, as I mentioned this morning, due to greed and short-sighted. So lack of awareness and lack of, I think, sense of responsibility. At the same time, of course, the economy also very important, and use nature resources also have to use. That is, the extreme amount of
So the only approach is to really find a balance so that we don't go into either of the two extremes.
One real factor is human population. Population increasing. So they need more food, more everything.
More resources.
So that's difficult. So,
Your Holiness, if I could just comment, your comment about population reminds me of a cartoon of a boat in a stormy sea. And the boat is tipped like this.
yes.
This is the front of the boat, and this is the back of the boat. And in the front of the boat, you have tiny little ant-like people. Tiny. They're all over, but they're tiny little ant-like people. And some are falling overboard. And back here, you have some big, very big individuals. And the big people in the back, and the boats like this, are saying, hey, you, up in the bow, up in the front, stop overpopulating. And, you know, stop reproducing. And really, it's, of course, a combination of, you know, these big people in the back are like Americans and Canadians and Europeans that, you know, we have a very big environmental footprint. We are consuming, you know, per person consumption is enormous. So each of us are big and we're sinking. But, of course, you know, population is also a key problem. And we can't ignore it. We can't just say it's just the overconsumption. But that's something where we're having, I think, the least progress in reducing per person energy and resource consumption. Overpopulation is absolutely a major problem. But I think through the education of women and giving women opportunities, we are having more success in slowing population, even though it's still a major problem, more success in curbing population than in putting those big guys in the back of the boat, putting them on an energy diet.
The lifestyle that change.
So it's definitely the case that we have to seriously think of changing the lifestyle.
It seems there are a lot of sort of contradictions. See, in the West, you see people very much prefer the fit, body, but
healthy
and
and
meantime,
fit.
eating, and then that won't be gonna that. Yeah, 유즈지까지 되게. 예. 누저 믿으는 시기스 시작하면서 야구를 쓰도스. 약반은 관조를 디셨어요.
His Holiness is talking about something that he heard from his senior tutor, the late senior tutor, Jebjit Lingrambache. He was talking about how, you know, Western people often talk about the importance of losing weight on health, but most of the people who say these things themselves are quite overweight.
Yes, yes.
That is sad. I think, as you mentioned, awareness not sufficient, must implement. Okay.
Well, our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States has labeled overweight and obesity as our #1 epidemic in the United States.
세상에.
60%. 60% of Americans are overweight.
그래서 주주도 안 봐.
Just defense ministry notice도.
No.
because new kaza. Mamia sabiyan.
Recruits.
Recruits are facing some problem.
Yeah.
Because of overweight.
No.
American Defense Ministry was talking about the problem of new recruits being overweight. Yeah.
I have one.
Well,
Yes.
we have Matthew and Deanna.
Oh, okay.
And
Yes,
we have
to-
10 minutes.
To look a bit back at the bigger picture, because you ask about what is natural, what is intact. This morning is only as mentioned in 3 million years, the sun will become a supernova and explode. And cosmologists say if it never expands, in a few billion years, it will all be atoms of iron. So all this is natural. So now, what is special maybe about human beings, of course, the presence of human beings is completely natural. Everything in this nature is natural. But when technology came in, then what is certainly new is the multiplying effect of being 1,000 times more powerful than what nature has biologically given to man. So that, of course, is not natural because it happened, but it's certainly completely new in terms of biological evolution. And the same is true for waste. In ancient times, stones, wood, leather, you just throw it, it disappears. Now waste is accumulating, toxic waste, atomic waste, and all kinds of waste.
Plastic never dies.
Yeah, plastic never dies, and so so many of those toxic waste. So there's two problems: the vast multiplying effect of technology on our biological strength, and the enormous amount of waste which was irrelevant before is certainly something very new. So natural, we can discuss, but what we can certainly face as objective is, I think, which is very much everyone's concern, is how to reduce suffering. How much we can reduce suffering in terms of displacement of population due to climate change. The poorest population in the world are most affected, though they are not the cause. So in fact, we'll never stop the sun exploding in a few million years. But in the meantime, we can certainly do whatever we can to reduce suffering. And I think seems to be the most reasonable approach, except of saying this is natural, impermanence is there. And so that's more practical. Yeah. Oh, and one question I was asked at the break, in India and many places, they burn the corpses at cremations. Someone was saying it would be better to bury them under the ground because that might contribute to carbon emission.
Baba Amdi one organization near Nagpur, that whole colony, the handicapped people,
disabled.
So their tradition, they start one sort of practice. Anyone who die, instead of burning. Salpe. And the bash as such the shingstu.
So they have a custom that anyone who dies is wrapped up and then buried underground, and a new tree is planted on the spot. So which His Holiness feels is wonderful.
I know that person now already passed away.
The founder.
Wonderful person.
The founder.
Baba Amdi. Actually, the part of my money, which received from Nobel
Peace Prize,
I donated that organization. Wonderful organization. Now I'm wondering, I don't know, after he passed away, what happened to his organization? But now you see people, small pockets here, really, I think, they're making some effort. But we are lacking because of the
more collective, global.
Collective way.
No.
So such as our sort of the organization. I think, of course, I think I want to discuss this here with some member. 그게 이해하시지. 딱그 털대 누구스 같은 거. 띵안 줘도 아주 싫어야 하면서 내친 거.
So one thing that His Holiness was saying that he would wish is that there are so many various initiatives being taken from so many different quarters. But what seems to be lacking is an attempt to coordinate and bring them all together in an integrated way to really bring out its impact and effect.
And also gives the opportunity to share experience. One small group is doing here, share with other people in order to help awareness and then implementation. So within this country, India, I found, at least as far as I know, I think several small organizations in Rajasthan, in Maharashtra, and Mysore. At least I have some sort of opportunity to visit this area. So they're really dedicated people. Because of improving the condition in the village.
At the local level.
So about lack of coordination.
That's the way forward, and the international health community, starting from the World Health Organization, is now calling for something that they call health in all policies. It's a new movement to say, at least I'm just speaking from health, but that energy, agriculture, transportation, business, economics, at least from the health point of view, the official World Health Organization, that body, is saying we have to work across sectors, across knowledge bases, or we won't be able to solve these problems. If we have a Ministry of Health and a Ministry of Environment and a Ministry of Finance, every time there's progress for one, there'll be negative for another. And so there's a major call now to integrate, and there's this international movement called Health in All Policies, and I think you're exactly right. Unless you get all of those perspectives working together, and embracing the complexity and the interdependence, we won't be able to solve the problems.
True, exactly. Problem is huge problem, and a very complicated problem. Through awareness, through education, awareness, and full of sort of sense of responsibility, sense of community. And doesn't matter what nation, this nation, that nation, or this believer or not that believer. Doesn't matter. We must work on the level of fundamental human level. We are all same human being. But I don't know. When I hear, listen, those of the prediction after 30 years or 40, 50 years, then me personally, no need to worry. When these serious problems happen, then I may be in heaven or hell. But we have to work. We have to work. It is our responsibility to save her,
to create
the next generation. And at least, as I mentioned earlier, at least I think next few centuries. Then their business. After 1,000, few thousand, 10,000, and I don't know. And that depends on the mercy of Sun, isn't it?
Well, then, actually, we've reached the end of our time this afternoon.
Thank you.
So I want to thank all the participants and you, Your Holiness, for giving your time.
Now, next session is some discussions. I will not be.
With the monastics.
Yes, the next session is to answer the questions of the monastics. Yes.
That's right.
There'll be a little tea break, and then we'll reconvene here.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. See you again.
Excellent. Your Holiness, this afternoon we're going to look at a different aspect of environmental science, and this is the relationship between the changes that Diana talked about and the health consequences. One of the points you made was saying if it was a doctor telling you you had to change because it's good for your health, then more people would want to. And Dr. Jonathan Patz has the science that makes that case, at least at the global level. You should know that Jonathan is a professor at the University of Wisconsin. The main thing you should know, he lives down the street from Richie Davidson. And they often bicycle together. Good friends. But Jonathan is...
You may also have little the sense of competition.
What about cooperation? Could be cooperation. So, Jonathan is director of the Global Health Institute at the university. His specialty is ecology and health, very important field. He's co-chair of the group that wrote the health report of the United States National Assessment on Climate Change. He was the lead author on the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that won the Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore for that work.
One of the lead authors, not the lead author.
The lead author.
One of the lead authors. Lead author 망보여서봐.
He's a humble scientist. Yeah, one of the. He's also founding director of the International Association for Ecology and Health, which are scientists globally who are studying this change. And of course, he's written many, many scholarly books and papers on this link. So that will be the topic for this afternoon. Jonathan?
And thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. Your Holiness, it's such an honor for me to be here presenting to you. And what I'd like to do is pick up on a statement that you said in the introduction, which was, given the science, what are the implications of the science? And my role here is to take the environmental science presented by Professor Diana Liverman and ask the question, so what does that mean for human health and well-being? So I'm going to be trying to answer your question about the implications and look at the risks and the ethical aspects, because some people, some populations will be disproportionately affected. So I look at the ethics and in the end take a look at the interdependence of environment and health and the interdependent risks and also opportunities. So this is the outline of my presentation. Number one, looking at the health impacts of one of the issues that Professor Liverman talked about, climate change. And I'll use climate change as a case study of the ethical dimension of environment and health. After that, I'll talk about the interdependence of environment and global health, looking at giving you some examples of how complex these relationships really are. And finally, number three, based on those interdependencies of risks, if everything is interrelated, then maybe there are interdependencies in benefits. So if we solve one problem, maybe we'll solve two or three at the same time. So this is the structure of my presentation. So first, let me talk about this case study of health effects of climate change and why this is a huge ethical dilemma. So here you have a map of the world, and this is what you see are climate-sensitive diseases. Looking at over the last 30 years from greenhouse gas warming will have an impact. So the next question is, who's causing that climate change? You know, this is looking at greenhouse gas effect on climate from 1960 to 1990. These are the countries that will experience the most disease change from the warming. So who's causing the warming? And that's what this map is. And what you see, of course, Africa is in green. They're not really producing greenhouse gases, not burning much fossil fuels, as Diana was talking about. The United States, and this is where I'm embarrassed to be from the United States. But the United States, over the last 50 years, from 1950, and remember the graphs going up, from 1950. From 1950 to 2000, the US is the #1 contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So you could say that we in the United States are the most responsible country for causing climate change and causing this ill health in other parts of the world. China is #2, India, former Soviet Union, Canada, you know, they're up there. But, you know, this is where you see that these countries that will suffer the most are not responsible for the original problem. Now, let's take a look at this same data in a different format. And what you're seeing here is a data-driven map. We call this a cartogram, but this is where
the subtasodante data shilishabaton subtasodance link down cartograms yoris alone. Can you explain? Yeah.
So the size of each country is represented by the number. So on the bottom, again, remember, these are disease numbers. And these are actually mortality numbers in malaria, diarrheal disease, and malnutrition. And so these countries, the bigger the country, the bigger the problem, the bigger the change in those diseases from warmer climates. So on the bottom, you see...
Maybe hygiene is also a factor here.
Those is the poorer area. The hygiene also difficult.
Well, that's true, and in fact, the poorer you are, the more directly affected you are by changing environments. In a heat wave, if you're wealthy, you can have air conditioning. If you're poor, you're exposed. If you have an increased risk of malaria and mosquito-borne diseases, if you have no shelter, no windows, no screens, you're at higher, you definitely, poverty plays a role in your exposure, your risk for exposure. So what you see is, you know, a lot of suffering. Look at all the suffering in Africa and India. Lots of suffering. But look at the greenhouse gas emissions. Africa just shrivels up. Africa is not really responsible, and the developing world is not responsible for causing global climate change, and yet they're the ones most vulnerable at first. And this, I think this is, to me, I'm not an ethicist, but traveling with Machu and others, and I'm becoming more ethical, I think. But I went to Bhutan with them. But to me, this difference between, you know, those most vulnerable being the least responsible for the problem is the largest ethical challenge that I can imagine. And when I look at this map and I learn more about Buddhism, I'd say, you know, this is where there's a huge role for compassion across nations. When we began the Industrial Revolution, where we've seen an increase in diseases like malaria, malnutrition, diarrheal disease, very environmentally, climatologically sensitive diseases, where have we seen an increase in these diseases linked to warming temperatures? And this analysis was done by the World Health Organization, and they looked at the amount of warming from 1960 to 1990, 30 years of greenhouse gases and warming. And they asked the question, what would that small amount of warming, temperature-wise, what would that mean for these climate-sensitive diseases, malaria, malnutrition, diarrheal disease.
Jonathan, could you explain why they're climate sensitive? Give an example.
malnutrition 또 잠깐만.
So how does malnutrition be related to climate?
For example.
Okay, so malnutrition, of course, depends on adequate crops, which depend on adequate climate. So droughts, droughts mostly. But something like malaria,
Yes, that's right.
which is carried by an insect, mosquito, is very sensitive to external environmental conditions.
True.
If I had a cold and I coughed on you, which I don't worry. But I am 37 degrees centigrade, and if I was to cough on you, this virus would go to another 37 degrees centigrade environment, right? There's not much interaction with the environment. But something like a mosquito-borne disease, like malaria, a lot of the life cycle of that biological system, the parasite, the insect, is very sensitive to the temperature outside. So if the parasite, and I'll show an example in a minute, parasite in the mosquito can be affected by local air temperature. So some of these indirectly transmitted diseases, be they insect-borne or waterborne diseases, are more environmentally sensitive. So that's why they pick, the World Health Organization picked those diseases. So if you look on the map, the red and orange indicate locations with the most climate-sensitive diseases, like malaria and malnutrition. And notice that, former Soviet Union, Canada, the United States, we don't have many of these diseases. And
The southern part of Africa, climatically, not very hot.
it's already hot.
Not very hot.
Not very hot.
Not very hot. The southernmost part.
So the southern hemisphere is very
southern.
like Australia, these. Why is it here? This belongs to red.
Right.
Climatically, it's not something.
So from a kind of a point of view of climate itself, those parts of Africa are not that
The
hot
southern
compared to
tip.
southernmost tips. But why are they in red?
Right. This analysis actually shows the modeling of future. So this is showing the change in those diseases. So even though there are more cases of malaria, in this region than in South America, the question the World Health asked is, based on what we know about malaria and its relationship to temperature, where will we see the biggest change?
Biggest increase.
And so,
Jonathan, you mean increase?
Increase. So, so in fact, it could be that the countries right next to a country with the most malaria, that adjacent country may see the biggest change. So again, these are where the World Health Organization believes climate change double. The risk of hunger could double by the middle of this century. One other example, we talked about malaria and why malaria is so sensitive. This is a graph that shows the relationship between temperature and the parasite as it develops inside the mosquito. What you see is that on the y-axis, temperature, as temperature increases, goes up, the number of days that it takes this parasite, these are two of the main parasites that cause malaria, the number of days that it takes for that parasite to develop inside the mosquito becomes fewer and fewer.
Yes.
So that as temperature rises, mosquitoes are infectious more quickly. So warmer temperatures can lead to malaria epidemics because of this relationship. I do want to just caution you, though, that while you need the right temperature to have the development of malaria, notice that this line flattens out. Whoops. Notice the line flattens out here, which means that below a certain temperature, malaria cannot develop, right? But you need temperature, but this is not the only thing that is causing malaria epidemics. So all sorts of issues, population migration, bed net therapies, drug resistance. There are many factors. So I don't want you to think that climate is everything. But you must have the right temperature or you can't have malaria. And malaria kills between 1.5 to 2 million people every year. Most of the deaths are in children. So with this climate temperature-sensitive disease like malaria that's mostly affecting children, this is one of the aspects of ethics of climate change, an intergenerational problem. We're mostly affecting children. And according to the World Health Organization, nearly 90% of climate change health risks would affect children. And diarrheal disease being one, malaria, malnutrition. These are all diseases especially affecting children. But there's another element of the ethical aspects, so not only intergenerational, but places, different regions, different populations will have different extent of risk. This is a map of Bangladesh. Whoops, how did that happen? Whoops, sorry. Here's a map of Bangladesh. And Bangladesh, is a very low-lying country. It's in the river delta. And what this map shows is everything in dark blue here would go underwater with a 1.5 meter of sea level rise. Now, as Dr. Liverman mentioned, there are issues of climate change, including extremes in temperature, extremes of the water cycle, both floods and droughts. But a third one is sea level rise. And the estimates right now, simply from warming the ocean, warming salt water, it expands, thermal expansion of the oceans, would raise the ocean around a meter, or Diana can correct me on the latest figure, but approximately one meter or so. And this is without glaciers falling into the ocean. So if land-based glaciers, like on Greenland, slip into the ocean, we may have 5 to 10 meters of sea level rise. So this is only looking at the thermo expansion, the warming the oceans, raising a meter. This would displace 17 million Bangladeshis simply from sea level rise. They would have to move. And the health issues of moving population 170 years ago. And we built the steam engine, and we burned coal and oil and developed the automobile. We didn't know it was a problem. We didn't know that, burning that pollution and putting in the air, we didn't know that it was harmful. But now we know. And with that knowledge, that what we do in one place affects an innocent person somewhere else, now that we understand that linkage, this is where we need compassion at the United Nations and all over the world to look at that suffering and balance it.
So ethics idea, as well, out of ignorance, and chicken never should be in it. Depends. Doesn't matter. Right. She isn't. That is single to 7 ethical already.
So this clearly shows that the relationship between ethical responsibility versus knowledge. If you were ignorant in the past, then of course there's less moral responsibility. Right. But once you have the knowledge, then of course the ethical responsibility becomes even more important.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. So here are just some examples.
So someone was saying, those of us who are living in Dharamsala, we are not responsible. That's
right. So these are just some examples of the health effects of climate change. We know that people die in heat waves. Last year, India had a record temperature, 50 degrees centigrade. Hundreds of people died. So we know that there are some significant health effects from extreme weather. So where else in the world are we having record-breaking summer temperatures?
빠르게 야구라면 디 배수 주는 그런 게.
나
빠르게 야구라면 배수 주는 그런 거.
배수스나.
배수 주는.
알레레. It's only to saying that the photograph doesn't seem to be that compelling because the person is wearing a woolen shirt there. Long sleeves.
Touché. Your Holiness, you are extremely observant. So where?
Oh, yes, okay.
Okay. So India experienced a record summer temperature last year. Where else in the world might we expect record-breaking summer temperatures? This is a map. This is science done that shows where in the world, in the future, in the next few decades and this century, where we may experience the hottest summers ever recorded in history. And everything in orange, here's the top map, everything in orange or red has a 70% probability or greater, 70 or greater percent probability of experiencing the hottest summer ever recorded. And this is by the middle of this century, only 30 to 50 years from today. These are places, and I think, nearby here, very hot, hottest ever. Now, what about by the end of this century? That's at the bottom. And everything in red indicates places with greater than 90% probability of being hotter than ever recorded in history. What we're concerned from the public health point of view is that today, already 800 million people are at risk from hunger. And these types of extreme temperatures in the summer would be devastating for crops. And according to these scientists published in a very prestigious journal, the journal Science, one of the top two science journals in the world, these scientists believe from their modeling that hunger could